Signore e signori, buonasera. Good evening, everybody. And I wish I could say welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimo, like I normally do. We are in a virtual Casa Italiana, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this virtual space. It's the first installment of our new series, Tutti a Casa, live chats on all good things Italian. And I couldn't be happier with the guest I have today. He's a longtime friend, not only of mine, but also of Casa Italiana. Professor Nicola Gardini is full professor of Italian and comparative literature at Oxford University, and he joins us live from Oxford. Ciao Nicola, come va?
Oh, good evening, everyone. Very well. I'm very glad to be here with you all.
And since we want to stay within the radio limits we gave ourselves, as we know, we are publicizing these talk shows as radio-style, web-based talks. I will not tell you the entire biography of Nicola Gardini because that would take me the entire time allotted for the broadcast. Let me tell you that we are very proud to say that Professor Gardini has a PhD in comparative literature from New York University. So we're very proud that he's an alumnus of New York University now at Oxford. Nicola has a very extensive bibliography, but he's not only a writer, translator, poet, essayist. He's also an artist, a visual artist. He's a fantastic painter. I strongly suggest you to familiarize yourself with everything that he does, really as close as you get to a Renaissance man nowadays. By looking up his website, nicolagardini.com. And among the things I want to quote that Nicola has done recently is an essay that took Italy by storm, Viva il Latino, Long Live Latin, that has been translated and published very recently in the United States. So Long Live Latin is available wherever books are sold in the US. And it was a huge success, not only for Nicola himself, but for the Latin language, I would dare to say, in Italy. So before we start to talk about our Machiavelli, beloved Machiavelli for both of us, I just want to ask Nicola a couple of things about his Long Live Latin. Nicola, what happened that everybody in Italy read the book, is reading the book, is talking about the book, and now the book is traveling. It's been translated into the 5 main languages, published in the US. Is it you or is it Latin?
I think a bit of both, because it was supposed to be just a memoir about why I ended up loving that language so much ever since I was a child, which was all the more peculiar given the fact that my family is not a family of Latinists, and my parents had no literary background whatsoever. Nonetheless, I was very much drawn to this language through school. So I ended up starting, asking myself, how does one end up loving a language, and Latin in particular? So in the end, the book became a sort of a biography of me as a learner of Latin, but also of the beautiful discoveries that one goes through when they read Latin and in a way give up all kind of, superstructure coming from school, academia, journalism. So you open up Ovid, and what does Ovid tell you? What do you find in Ovid, in Cicero, in Virgil? So in the end, I took Latin as a living organism, giving itself opportunities to become better, to become more and more perfected as a medium of communication and of inspection. And the book came out as a very affable, my readers tell me, essay. It stirred up a polemic and a debate about the usefulness of Latin and Greek in Italy, but not just there. So in the end, it was really a surprise for me, for my publisher, for everyone who in the end believed in it, but not so much to start with.
And you are at what edition in Italy? How many?
Oh, there were like 25, something like that. I mean, it's it's been a bestseller.
Yeah, Nicola,
Yes,
before we continue with Long Live Latin, maybe we should have an individual broadcast on Latin and the differences in which it's perceived. You teach in one of the contemporary temples to Latin or to classic culture, so that would be an entire other chapter. But Latin in Latin countries and Latin in England and in the U.S. It
indeed.
would be very fascinating to see also the reception in these different worlds.
Absolutely.
I just want to mention your last essay from last year called Rinascere, Storie Maestri di un'idea italiana. These are, I believe, 10 profiles of 10 people who made the Renaissance. And there are some expected characters, protagonists, including our own, Nicola Machiavelli, that we are talking about today. But there are also some non-expected, prevedibile characters that you mentioned. Tell us one that you think you wanted to put in deliberately because it's not presently in the canon, hasn't received the attention it deserves, and you try to somehow make up for that. Just one of 10.
Well, I included a couple of at least Neo-Latin poets. A lot of the Renaissance happened in Latin, and in the university we tend to forget that because we study modern languages. But especially if we do Italian Renaissance, we focus on the Italian language. A lot of the Renaissance was written in Latin. And there were amazing authors. I included one, a doctor, a medical doctor, Girolamo Fracastoro, who's credited with the invention of the term syphilis, not only with the term, but with the observation of symptoms, the spread of the epidemic, and also the cure. Of course, it was not the cure, because the cure would happen only much later in time. Nonetheless, Fracastoro did recommend ways to alleviate and mitigate the disastrous effects of syphilis. I think I was not thinking, of course, that a pandemic would happen that soon, but I think that chapter is, in some way, very relevant to what we're going through right now. It's a very this author worked hard to understand why we get infected, what happens when people get together, what it means to lose the sense of one's body, and where infection does actually start. So he wrote a beautiful poem on this, a very Virgilian poem.
It's a poem in Latin about syphilis.
Indeed. You would say that's the least poetical thing in the world. It's one of the great masterpieces of the Renaissance, early 16th century.
Could you remind our listeners the title of Fracastoro's poem on syphilis?
Syphilis.
It's called Syphilis.
Yeah.
So easy to remember. No, but you're right. It couldn't be more timely. Does Fracastoro has something that could be useful for us in this whole idea of contagion and how you transmit and how the fear that it instills in people? Anything that is timely and contemporary that can be helpful for us as we're dealing with a very, very scary situation?
Well, I think his democratic look on how peoples live. There were many theories about syphilis being imported from France or from the United States, actually. I mean, from America. Sorry for the slip. Actually, Fracastoro is very open to the idea that we need evidence and we can't just put the blame on anyone in particular. And this is a very modern and very democratic attitude, because in my university too, in the University of Oxford, where I'm talking from, the vice chancellor circulated a very beautiful email when the
Nicola,
epidemic.
where exactly are you in this moment? You are at Oxford University. Where are you physically?
I am in my college of affiliation, which is Keble College. And you're all very welcome to visit me when we can go back to our flights. So I'm speaking from my room in college, where I generally teach and receive my students. Well, I was mentioning the beautiful email from the vice chancellor, very much in the spirit of Fracastoro, where she says. We're very aware that things may have started from in China and spread from there, but let's not put the blame on anyone. So I think that's a wonderful message, which we people of letters, people of open perspectives should always stand for, and that started indeed at a time, the early 16th century, when the vision of things was not that open as it can be today. Fracastoro stands out as a very good observer and very intelligent and insightful observer of things he could hardly understand, because of course contagion was hardly understandable back then. He still rests on Aristotelian notions. So the agents of infection were unknown, and therefore he could not have, but in his poetry, which is beautiful, full of detail, full of pathos, full of piety and respect for the sufferers, he does say, there's a lot we don't know, and let's wait till we know more. And that, I think, is a good...
So at some level, he has a very scientific attitude. Admitting that you don't know more about things, that's the first step towards science, even in a pre-modern science world.
Yeah.
We have spoken for how long? 10 minutes? And I already want to bring you back to talk first of Fracastoro and then of Long Live Latin, for our friend Machiavelli. And before we start, I just want to invite our friends who are listening in, who are watching us, to go to the websites that are going to be listed in the comment site underneath our screen right now. And that was also given in the invitation, in the announcement that we sent out from Casa Italiana yesterday, or you can find them in the website of Casa Italiana, because Professor Gardini and I are going to read 2 paragraphs of this letter, and we're going to read them in Italian. We spoke about whether to read them in English or Italian, but we agree that Machiavelli's prose, especially in this letter, is so beautiful, so elegant, and so musical that we could not give up on the Italian. But when we discuss them, we will keep the discussion in English and we'll refer to English translations of the letter. So I just wanted to tell you this. So in the meantime, if you wanted to, you can pull up either the translation or the original, and you have links for both in the comment section of the video, so you can follow what we're reading. We have decided to read only 2 paragraphs of the letter. I will read the first, and Professor Gardini is going to read the other one. What is this letter? When does it come? Where is Machiavelli? What is he doing? Very quickly, because we don't want to give a course on Machiavelli. For that, you will have to enroll either at Oxford or at New York University. But just to give you a sense of the importance and the beauty of this letter. So Machiavelli was employed in the Florentine Republic. He was a convinced Republican. He didn't believe in monarchies, even if he became to be famous as the theoretician and the thinker that supported absolute power. So he was a very important member. He was a very important high-ranking bureaucrat of the Florentine Republic. He never enjoyed diplomatic status, but he was basically doing the job of an ambassador, and his job was in the Palazzo Vecchio, so in the Palace of Power. You can still visit his office. You would say he was some sort of diplomat with the rank of Undersecretary of State, roughly speaking, if we need to find a comparison with the administration of the United States. It was a very strategic position. Of course, Florence, even if it was a relatively small state, basically a city with some surrounding territories, occupied a strategic position in Europe at that time, and therefore enjoyed diplomatic representatives in all the major courts of Europe. And Machiavelli would be the one interacting with the ambassadors, sending requests, asking them to investigate on specific things, and telling them what to say, what to do to the princes where they were staying at, in the states in which they were staying. He was preparing briefings for the leaders of the Republic with the reports coming from the different ambassadors. He couldn't have had a best point of observation. Imagine somebody who basically lives in the Situation Room of the White House for years. And therefore, he had an understanding of all the political dealings in Europe that was second to none. And that will come very handy when, after the fall of the Republic, the return of the Medici in 1512, after being put under trial, tortured, and he's forced into what we can call internal exile, in the sense that he was not sent outside of Florence. He was sent to house arrest, roughly speaking, in his own farmhouse in what is now called Sant'Andrea in Percussina, where he did feel in exile. Machiavelli loved politics and loved being in the middle of it. He loved being in the Palazzo Vecchio and knowing everything that was going on in the world. And for the rest of his life, he missed that. And the irony is that from his property that you can visit in Sant'Andrea in Percussina, the house, of course, has been restored, redone, remade, but more or less, what it must have looked like. From his property, when he took probably his morning stroll, you can see Florence. At some point, it feels like you can almost touch the dome of the cathedral. So it's a sort of Tantalus torture he was subject to, because he could see the city, he could see the palaces of power where he wanted to be, and he couldn't be there. He couldn't participate in the making of politics. That's what he was interested in. But his forced lockdown, you can say political lockdown, internal confinement, call it as you wish, of course, gave him a chance to come up with what is considered the first and probably the most important treatise in political science, the founding text of political science, The Prince. So this letter is very important for a variety of different reasons. First of all, because it gives us a first-hand account of how Machiavelli lived his life in this small hamlet close to Florence. Second, because it talks about what he does in the time that it's really his own, when he can finally devote his time to reading, especially classical texts. And then it's a condensed version of The Prince. That's the last part. We're not going to read that. But he basically tells his friend is Vettori, who is the Florentine ambassador in Rome to the papal court. Very prestigious position, and also somehow not very useful at this time, because it happened that the leader of Florence and the Pope were first cousins. So they really didn't need an ambassador, could have talked directly, but still that was the protocol. And Vettori, Francesco Vettori, represented the interest of Florence, at this point still a republic in name, at the papal court. Of course, the papal court was the place to be. That's really where you knew everything and more. You had access to the cardinals, you had access to all the princes that came to visit. And Machiavelli, who is sincerely a friend of Vettori, is also somehow envious of these access that Vettori has. And you can tell that he spends a lot of time telling how he lives to Francesco Vettori. And on some level, and we're going to talk about that with Professor Gardini, I believe also to make him feel a bit sorry for the unfair destiny that has fallen upon him of being exiled. So this was a very long premise, and I'm sorry. Nicola, is there anything you want to add to these?
Oh, it's a very necessary premise, and I think you put it very, very well, Stefano. Maybe we want to make it more explicit. The letter, which is very beautifully constructed, in the end turns out to be almost a plea. A plea. Get me back to Florence. Let me have the life you are complaining about. I would really love to exchange it. Exchange mine for yours. We know Vettori could not be much help because Machiavelli will never be restored to his previous office. Nonetheless, I mean, we have probably something more important than his office, this amazing text, The Prince. Yeah.
So, Nicola, we're going to start reading the letter. I'll go first. So this is not the beginning of the letter. He tells him a variety of other things, including very daily things, his dealings in Florence, businesses that he left undone, unfinished, and other stuff. So it's also one of the features of this letter is how many registers there are present in the same letter. It's a letter to a friend, yet it's a letter to an ambassador. And he starts addressing him magnificent ambassador, the official title that at that time we used for ambassadors. And you will see just also in the only in the two paragraphs that Professor Gardini and I are going to read, you realize what I'm saying. So he's at the point in which he tells Francesco Vettori how he lives his life in Sant'Andrea. And remember, you can access the translation clicking under here. Partitomi dal bosco, io me ne vo ad una fonte, e di quivi in un mio uccellare. Ho un libro sotto, o Dante, o Petrarca, o uno di questi poeti minori come Tibullo, Ovidio e simili. Leggo quelle loro amorose passioni, e quelli loro amori ricordomi de mia. Godomi un pezzo in questo pensiero. Trasferiscomi poi sulla strada, nell'osteria, parlo con quelli che passano, dimando delle nuove dei paesi loro, intendo varie cose e noto vari gusti e diverse fantasie d'uomini. Viene in questo mentre l'ora del desinare, dove con la mia brigata mi mangio di quelli cibi che questa povera villa e paululo patrimonio comporta. Mangiato che ho, ritorno nell'osteria. Qui vi è l'oste, per l'ordinario un beccaio, un mugnaio, due fornaciai. Con questi io mi ingaglioffo per tutto dì, giuocando a cricche, tricche, tracche. E poi dove nascono mille contese e infiniti dispetti di parole ingiuriose. E il più delle volte si combatte un quattrino e siamo sentiti non di manco gridare da San Casciano. Così, rivolto intra questi pidocchi, traggo il cervello di muffa e sfogo questa malignità di questa mia sorta, sendo contento mi calpesti per questa via per vedere se la se ne vergognassi. We are brought in right into Machiavelli's life, and we go from this very bucolic beginning. He's in wood, he goes hunting. They were probably hunting birds with nets. That was the practice of the time. And he brings a book. It's either Dante or Petrarca. And he says, or one of these minor poets, such as Tibullus and Ovidius. Nicola, did he really believe that these were minor poets compared to Dante and Petrarch?
Well, of course not. Machiavelli writes in the vernacular. He's one of our greatest vernacular writers of all time, but he had his Latin. The sections of The Prince are still entitled with Latin titles, and those titles are reminiscent of Machiavelli's classical background. Well, this is a time in the history of the Italian language of great debates, which language to go for in literature, in the writing, and it's obvious that Latin is lagging behind. You know, Bembo, and not just Bembo, but especially Pietro Bembo are championing the exclusiveness of the monopoly of the vernacular, and those who still want to practice Latin will have to stay behind. Now, Machiavelli chooses to write in the vernacular He's also an expert on language and grammar. He's also, the author of a text on the Italian language. He not for one second would believe that these are minor poets. This is understatement, of course, and we need to understand the irony of this juxtaposition between Dante and Petrarch on the one hand, and the Tibullus and Ovid on the other. He's really conjuring up a major opposition, a taxonomy, which is highly and very much debated at this time. And he's obviously making an open stance for the vernacular. So he's telling his friend Vettori, but it's obvious that this letter was very much thought for us too. I'm going to be a follower of Dante and Petrarch. That is, I'm going to be one of the great vernacular authors of the Italian tradition. The Italian tradition will be established also thanks to my own writing. And indeed, he will tell us in a second, he wrote a book which will mark a very important achievement in the history of the Italian language and literature.
So he was very aware.
Very aware, very self-conscious, very self-conscious.
Very much Dante was aware that what he was doing was revolutionary and destined to remain for history. And we have to say also that, Nicola, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there was almost a century, the so-called Secolo senza poesia, in which basically after the great blooming of the Italian language in the Trecento, it seemed almost abandoned completely. And it's more or less in the time of Machiavelli with Poliziano and others that Italian is somehow revived. So he's aware of the fact that he is doing something historical using the vernacular and very much following in the tradition.
Indeed. And Florence, of course, has a very active role in this. Lorenzo de' Medici was a great patron of the vernacular, and his friend Poliziano, who was an accomplished Latinist and Greek scholar, helped him to compile the very first anthology of the Italian lyrical tradition, which was Tuscan. So Machiavelli knows this. But as you said, Stefano, we are in a very bucolic setting. Io me ne vo ad una fonte. Machiavelli is very good at playing with conventions here. He's locating this, quite fleeting remark on his readings in a pre-fashioned setting, which will immediately ring a bell to any, learned reader. This is a man who knows what he's doing. This is a man who knows what language to go for and what language is there for. Machiavelli has a very political understanding of language as action. This letter is a very good example of that in itself.
Nicola, I wanted also to underline, and then we move to your passage, what he does. There is, of course, a comic element, almost a caricature-like style when he portrays himself with these people. And I would say this is the part in which he wants to show his big shot friend, the ambassador, what he's left with, the butcher, the baker, and so on, screaming insults and playing cards and playing other games of that sort. And he uses the expression mingaglioffo. How would we translate it into English, this mingaglioffo? I become a rascal, I become a delinquent almost. I turn into a brigand or something like that, right?
Yeah, it's quite an infernal, in the Dantesque sense, setting. So we moved from the bucolic to the infernal. Also, the language becomes very colorful. Beccaio, mugnaio, fornaciai, mingaglioffo, giocando, crecca, tric, tra. Alliteration plays a role there. I mean, he's trying to conjure up this, turmoil of insults around just some money, because they're playing cards. They're doing what loafers do, what idlers do, not the Secretary of the Republic.
Yeah, it's like gambling, but of a low kind. They're not playing poker or the equivalent of or chess or something dignified like that. It's like low level games like that. One thing that always makes me think when I read this passage is also that he says that he sits outside of the osteria of the inn and asks the people that pass by about their villages. And he uses paesi, that of course in Italian means both village and country. And I cannot resist but think these men that for years knew everything that was going on in all the paesi d'Europa, in all the countries of Europe, doesn't resist. And he wants to know what goes on in the small villages around Sant'Andrea, around San Casciano. And he's curious. He's terribly curious, gossipy. He wants to know what goes on. So these human curiosity remains the same, whether it's the great courts of Europe or whether it's the dealings of the peasants and the merchants of San Casciano. But I want to move straight to the passage that you are going to read to us. And I like the idea that infernal thing, because with Dante, Petrarch, Tibullus, Ovidio just mentioned, it's almost reminiscent of Dante's Limbo, when Dante meets the great poets of antiquity, and it would be a great place. There is grass, and it's people are kind, and the names that he mentions are all his idols, all the great poets of antiquity, and yet at the same time they suffer the worst pain, that is, senza speme vivemo in desio, without hope we live with this endless desire to be united with God. But there is some sort of similarity in the ways in which he presents this first part of the paragraph. It's reminiscent of Dante's Limbo. He knew very well that Cantic, of course, and that canto in particular. Then there is the infernal part in the Osteria. And I think there is some sort of paradise, like heaven-like element to the passage that now you are going to read for us.
Yeah, ok. Venuta la sera, mi ritorno a casa ed entro nel mio scrittoio e in sull'uscio mi spoglio quella veste quotidiana piena di fango e di loto e mi metto panni reali e curiali e, rivestito condecentemente, entro nelle antiche corti degli antichi degli antiqui uomini, dove da loro ricevuto amorevolmente mi pasco di quel cibo che solum è mio e ch'io nacqui per lui, dove io non mi vergogno parlare con loro e domandarli della ragione delle loro azioni, e quelli, per loro umanità, mi rispondono, e non sento per 4 ore di tempo alcuna noia, sdimentico ogni affanno, non temo la povertà, non mi sbigottisce la morte. Tutto mi trasferisco in loro.
Nicola, I don't dare to ask you a question now. You just tell us. I have to just to add for our listeners that actually the reception of the classical world in the Renaissance was also your first essay, your first book, based largely on the dissertation you wrote at New York University. So we are definitely within your one of your main fields of expertise. How is it different? First of all, is it different the way in which Machiavelli enters into this relationship with classical authors from other contemporaries, other people of his time that were equally enthralled with ancient authors, with Latin and Greek authors?
Yeah, dialogue with antiquity is one of the key questions in the Renaissance. Indeed, it starts with Dante, and even before Dante himself. Dante is one of the great classicists before humanism and before the Renaissance. Nonetheless, some things do change quite radically with Petrarch. There's a shift towards a more historical understanding of the chronological and cultural distance between us here now in the present, and them back there somewhere waiting for us to make an effort to reach for them. So with Petrarch, antiquity becomes the land of nostalgia, to quote Nietzsche. You must turn back. You must make an effort to go towards them. And if you can, you will get there. Otherwise, it will just remain an impulse which will keep renewing itself endlessly. So antiquity is metaphorized as a space, as something far. Machiavelli does the same thing. In this respect, he's very classical, is very Petrarchan to some extent. But for him, going back to the ancients doesn't mean to just write wonderfully like they did. It doesn't just mean to acquire their Latin and write in their Latin. It means to ask them what they did. He uses the word azioni. He wants to meet them to learn how to act. So this idea of imitation, which is so central to the Renaissance mind, in Machiavelli is very originally put as behavior, as also a schooling for today's politics. Machiavelli was a great historian too. He had a very good understanding of how things happen in the given circumstances, and he knew very well that circumstances change. Nonetheless, he attempted to create a science of political rules, laws that would apply no matter when. This is something, for example, others wouldn't share. His friend Guicciardini, another very important writer of the same time, an historian, a political figure himself, would just contradict completely this faith in the possibility to learn from the past. Guicciardini would tell you, we don't know what happens just across the street. How could we possibly learn from the ancients? Just go back to his Ricordi, this very kind of autobiographical series of reflections on history, and you will find such statements. Machiavelli, who apparently had no reason to stay an optimist, if we read this letter, his life was very miserable. Nonetheless, politically, is always open to solutions, and antiquity provides solutions. He still shares with his Dante the love for antiquity. Let's not forget that when Dante meets Virgil in the first canto of Inferno, he speaks of love, of the grande amore for Virgil. Amore comes back in this letter, amorevolmente. So he's also kind of continuing in the wake of Dante. He's aware of that. Machiavelli is a man of strong links with tradition, even though he's so innovative. But Machiavelli is innovative in the semantics, not so much in the terminology. The terminology in Machiavelli is very traditional, very classical, and that's what makes him so elusive and so ambiguous. In the end, he's very, very clear once we get it. And what do we need to get here? We need to enter a very special space, that of interlocution, dialogue, exchange. We need to ask questions and receive answers. The space is provided by the library, the scrittoio. Where does the scrittoio come from? And then I'm going to conclude. The scrittoio is, of course, a physical space. It's also called studio, studiolo. But this scrittoio, even though it exists, is actually a literalization of what ancient rhetoric would call a locus, a place, the place where memory, according to ancient theorists, starting from Cicero, but the Greeks also had said this before, the locus is a place where memory stores information and where we know we must go back in order to retrieve what we need for the speech and for our speech to be successful politically. Now, that locus, which is a mental locus, has become here a physical locus, an arena, a real arena for exchange and reciprocal advice. And that is very interesting, and I think quite original in the depiction of the encounter with the ancients. The encounter with the ancients is something that will always embarrass us to some extent. Why do we need them? Why? Aren't they just always with us no matter what happens? No, they're not always with us. We must look for them. and their distance is something we work towards. Machiavelli is a very good example of this effort, of this endeavor, which is intellectual, but also political. We must get truth from some source, from some authority. He is investing them with the authority to make him a better political thinker.
Nicola, thank you. As I said, I would go on with this conversation for hours and hours, but you already touched on very, very important issues. And you helped us also look at this letter in a different way. I must have read it hundreds of times, and yet you were able to bring up things that I've never noticed before. But the idea of the building of a place and donning these royal and curial robes is part of that physical creation from a mental space to a physical space. Just, do we agree it's the most beautiful letter of the Renaissance?
Yes, it's better. I'm very grateful to you, Stefano, for asking me to talk about this, because it's one of my favorite loci in literature. I always go back to it as a consolation. This letter tells us how we can turn our ugly days into the most creative opportunities of our lives.
We cannot leave our audience with a better message. As ugly as our days can be at this time, we can build our own locus, our own studiolo. And it doesn't need to be like the studiolo Federico da Montefeltro in Urbino, or of my Marchesana Isabella d'Este in Mantova, that were filled with paintings and ancient memorabilia. It is a space of the mind that you build through your books and through your readings. We couldn't leave our audience with a better message. Build your own locus, build your own studiolo in which you can find the real happiness that comes from knowledge. And thank you so much. Be sure, I'm gonna have you back for this series. It's either Fracastoro to continue Machiavelli, Latin, something, but we're gonna bring you back. And I just want to remind our audience that our next appointment is this coming Friday, and it's going to be with Antonio Monda, who is the artistic director of the Rome Film Festival. And we're going to talk about good films for a cloistered life. We're going to talk about Fellini in its 100th anniversary. And since Easter is approaching, I think Antonio also is going to have some suggestions on cinema and spirituality. So please join us again for Tutti a Casa this coming Friday. And again, thank you so much. Grazie mille. Nicola Gardini from Oxford. Thank you.
Auguri. Bye.